I arrived at Thornfield Manor on a cold afternoon in November of 1893, when the sky hung low and grey over the Derbyshire hills, and if you find yourself drawn to stories of quiet longing and difficult choices, I hope you'll stay with me through what I have to tell. The position had come to me through an agency in London, a temporary placement, they said, to care for the wife of Mr. Edmund Ashford, a gentleman of considerable means whose estate lay some miles beyond the nearest village. I was 24 years old then, the daughter of a country vicar who had died 2 years prior, leaving me with little beyond my education and the necessity of earning my own way. I had worked as a governess before in smaller households, but never in circumstances quite like these. The manor itself was beautiful in that austere, unyielding manner of old English houses, built when beauty was understood to include severity. Grey stone walls rose 3 stories high, with narrow windows that caught what little light the autumn sky offered. The grounds were extensive, formal gardens gone somewhat wild, a small lake visible through bare trees, and beyond that, moorland stretching toward distant hills. It was the sort of place that seemed to exist outside of time, where the modern world with its railways and telegraphs felt very far away indeed. Mrs. Ashford, I was told by the housekeeper who met me at the door, had been ill for nearly 3 years. The nature of her illness was never precisely named, something to do with her nerves, her constitution, perhaps her heart. She rarely left her rooms. She required constant, quiet attendance. My duties would be simple: to sit with her, to read to her when she wished it, to ensure she took her medicines, to ring for the doctor if her condition worsened, and above all, to provide her with calm companionship so that Mr. Ashford might attend to the management of his estate and his business affairs without constant worry. I met Mrs. Ashford that first evening. Her rooms occupied the east wing of the 2nd floor, a bedroom, a sitting room, and a small conservatory where potted plants struggled toward the limited sunlight. She was perhaps 30 years old, though illness had given her the translucent quality of someone much older. Pale blonde hair, pale skin, pale blue eyes that seemed to look at you without quite seeing you. She was not unkind. When I introduced myself, she smiled faintly and said she was glad I had come, that the last nurse had been too cheerful and it had exhausted her. I understood then what was wanted: not conversation, not entertainment, but simply presence. The kind of companionship that asks nothing and offers everything through silence. Mr. Ashford I did not meet until my 3rd day at Thornfield Manor. I had seen him at a distance, a tall figure crossing the grounds toward the stables, or standing at a window in what I later learned was the library. But we had not been formally introduced. The household ran on precise routines, and those routines kept the master and the hired nurse in separate orbits. When we finally met, it was by accident. I had gone down to the library in the evening, after Mrs. Ashford had fallen asleep, to find something to read to her the following day. The housekeeper had told me I was welcome to borrow books. I thought the room would be empty. Instead, I found him there, seated in a leather chair near the fire, a book open in his lap, though he was not reading it. He was looking into the flames with an expression of such profound weariness that I nearly retreated without speaking. He heard me, though, and stood immediately. "Forgive me," he said. "I didn't expect anyone at this hour." I apologized for the intrusion and explained my errand. He gestured toward the shelves with a kind of grave courtesy. "Please, take whatever you think might suit her. She used to love poetry, I think, before she became ill." His voice was low and measured, the voice of someone who has learned to contain whatever he might naturally feel. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the lean features of someone who spends too much time alone with his thoughts. There was nothing extraordinary in his appearance, yet there was something in the way he held himself, a sense of isolation so complete it seemed almost visible. I selected a volume of Tennyson and thanked him. He nodded and returned to his chair. I left quietly, aware that I had glimpsed something private, something not intended for observation. The days at Thornfield Manor acquired a rhythm. I woke early, took my breakfast in the small dining room reserved for upper servants, and went to Mrs. Ashford's rooms by 8 o'clock. She slept late most mornings, and I would sit in her conservatory with a book, listening to the silence of the house and the occasional cry of birds beyond the windows. When she woke, I would help her dress, though she rarely left her bedroom. We would sit together. Sometimes I read aloud. Sometimes we simply existed in the same space, she in her chair by the window, I with my needlework or a book, the hours passing with the slow, measured quality of water moving through deep channels. She spoke very little. When she did, her voice was soft and distant, as though she were speaking from the far side of a room much larger than the one we occupied. She would mention small things, a bird she had seen, a flower in the conservatory, something she remembered from her childhood. She never mentioned her husband. She never asked about my life. I understood that her world had contracted to the size of these rooms, and perhaps that was easier for her than engaging with anything beyond them. Mr. Ashford. I saw more frequently as the weeks passed. He would come to his wife's rooms each evening before dinner, spending perhaps half an hour sitting with her, speaking in low tones I could not hear from the adjoining room where I waited. His visits seemed dutiful rather than affectionate, yet there was a gentleness in how he spoke to her, a careful attention that spoke of long habit and deep responsibility. Sometimes, after these visits, I would encounter him in the corridors or on the stairs. We would exchange brief courtesies. He would ask if his wife's condition remained stable. I would confirm that it did. These conversations never lasted more than a minute or two, yet I found myself becoming aware of him in ways that troubled me. The way he carried himself, the careful control in his voice, the exhaustion that showed in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. All of it suggested a man bearing more than should be asked of any single person. Winter came on in earnest. Snow fell over the moors and the gardens, muffling the world in white silence. The days grew shorter. Mrs. Ashford seemed to fade with the light, sleeping more, speaking less. The doctor came weekly and said there was nothing to be done except to keep her comfortable. I understood that we were not working toward her recovery, merely maintaining a kind of suspension, a prolonging of what could not be cured. It was during this time that my encounters with Mr. Ashford began to change in character. One evening, as I was leaving Mrs. Ashford's rooms after she had fallen asleep, I found him in the corridor, standing at a window that looked out over the snow-covered grounds. He did not appear to be looking at anything in particular. He was simply standing there, as though he had forgotten why he had come. I hesitated, then asked if he was well. The question seemed to surprise him. He turned and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Forgive me," he said. "I'm not accustomed to being asked that question." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not have been an intrusion. After a moment, he continued, "Do you find it difficult, Miss Clark? Sitting with someone who is so far removed from the world? I imagine it must be rather isolating." I told him honestly that I did not find it difficult, that there was a kind of peace in it, though I understood it was not to everyone's taste. He nodded slowly. My wife was very different before her illness, very lively, very engaged with the world. It has been difficult to watch her withdraw so completely. I said that I could imagine it must be painful for him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for your care of her. I know she does not express gratitude, but I believe your presence brings her some comfort." I assured him it was my duty, though even as I spoke, I was aware that duty was not quite the right word for what I felt in that house. There was something else, something less defined, that had begun to take root. The winter deepened. The household contracted further into itself. The servants spoke in whispers. The fires burned low. Time seemed to slow to the pace of Mrs. Ashford's breathing, each day indistinguishable from the last. And yet, within this stillness, something was shifting. I had begun to notice things I should not have noticed. The way Mr. Ashford's voice changed when he spoke to me, becoming less formal, more unguarded. The way he had started to seek me out, not obviously, but in small ways, appearing in the library when I went to select books, walking in the garden at the same hour I took my brief daily exercise, finding reasons to ask my opinion on matters that surely did not require my input. I told myself these were meaningless coincidences. I told myself he was simply a lonely man in a difficult situation, seeking ordinary human contact. I told myself that what I was beginning to feel was nothing more than sympathy, the natural compassion anyone might feel for someone suffering under such burdens. But late at night, alone in my small room on the 3rd floor, I could not lie to myself so easily. I thought of him far more than was appropriate. I found myself listening for his footsteps in the corridors. When we spoke, I was aware of every word, every pause, every glance, and most troubling of all, I had begun to feel guilty, not for anything I had done, but for what I was thinking, for what I was feeling in a house where his wife lay ill and helpless, just 1 floor below where I slept. It was in late January that everything shifted irrevocably. A heavy snow had fallen, cutting us off from the village for several days. The doctor could not come for his weekly visit. The household felt more isolated than ever, a small island of warmth and light surrounded by endless white silence. Mrs. Ashford had been sleeping poorly, troubled by some distress she could not or would not name. I had spent much of the night sitting with her, and by morning I was exhausted. When she finally fell into a deeper sleep, I went down to the kitchen to ask for tea, thinking to take it back to her sitting room where I could rest while remaining near enough to hear if she woke. I found Mr. Ashford there, of all places, making tea himself. The cook had not yet risen, and he explained with something like embarrassment that he had not been able to sleep and had come down rather than wake any of the servants. We stood there in the dim kitchen, the only sound the whisper of the kettle beginning to boil. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw in his face something I recognized because I felt it myself. Loneliness. Not the simple loneliness of being alone, but the deeper loneliness of being unable to speak what you feel, of being trapped in circumstances that allow no easy escape, no simple comfort. "Miss Clark," he said quietly, "may I ask you something?" I told him he could. "Do you ever feel as though you're living in a house made of glass, where everything is fragile and you must move so carefully that you barely move at all?" I understood exactly what he meant. I told him yes, I did feel that way sometimes. He nodded, and for a long moment we simply stood there, the kettle beginning to sing. Then he said, "I find your presence here a great comfort. I thought you should know that." The words were simple, even innocent, yet I understood their weight. I understood what was being said beneath what was being said. And I understood that I was standing at a threshold, and that what I did next would matter. I told him, very quietly, that I was glad to be of service to his household. The words were careful, neutral, but my voice betrayed me. It was too soft, too unsteady. He heard it. I saw him hear it, and I saw the conflict that crossed his face, the same conflict I was feeling: want and restraint, longing and honor. He poured the tea without speaking again. We parted in the corridor outside the kitchen, and I carried my cup back upstairs with hands that trembled slightly. Nothing had happened. Nothing improper had occurred. Yet everything had changed. After that night, we began to talk more freely, though always briefly, always in passing, always with the proper distance maintained between us. He would tell me about the business of the estate, the letters he received, the ordinary concerns of a man managing land and tenants and investments. I would tell him about the books I was reading, my observations of the changing season, small memories from my childhood. These were not intimate conversations in any obvious sense, yet they felt intimate because they were honest, because we were showing each other who we truly were beneath the roles we occupied. And all the while, Mrs. Ashford slept in her rooms above us, her presence a constant reminder of why these conversations could never become anything more. Spring came slowly to Derbyshire. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown earth and the first green shoots. Mrs. Ashford seemed to improve slightly with the better weather, spending more time awake, occasionally even sitting in the conservatory to watch the birds return. The doctor said this was not unusual, that patients with her condition often rallied temporarily with the change of seasons. I should have been glad of this improvement. Instead, I found myself troubled by it because it meant she was more present, more real, more impossible to forget even for a moment. It meant the weight of what I felt for her husband pressed on me more heavily, because I could not forget that I was in her house, caring for her, earning my living through her need, all while feeling things I had no right to feel. Mr. Ashford and I began to avoid each other. Not obviously, but deliberately. We would hear each other approaching and turn down different corridors. We stopped encountering each other in the library. When he came to visit his wife, I would leave the rooms entirely, going down to the garden or simply standing in some distant hallway until enough time had passed. This should have made things easier. Instead, it made them worse. The absence felt more powerful than the presence had been. I found myself thinking of him constantly, wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he was thinking of me. It was a kind of madness, I knew, a folly born of isolation and proximity and the strange intimacy that develops between people trapped together in difficult circumstances. And yet I could not seem to master it. I had always thought of myself as a sensible person, practical and clear-headed. I had never been given to romantic fantasies. I understood my place in the world and had accepted it without bitterness. But this was beyond my capacity to simply reason away. It was in early May that matters came to a crisis. Mrs. Ashford had been sleeping through most of the afternoon, and I had gone out to walk in the garden, needing air and movement. The gardens were lovely that time of year, the formal beds coming back into bloom, the wild areas beyond them filled with bluebells and forget-me-nots. I walked without paying much attention to where I was going, following paths that wound between hedges and through archways overgrown with climbing roses not yet in bloom. I was lost in thought, turning over the question of whether I should give notice and leave Thornfield Manor, whether distance might be the only honest choice left to me. I came around a corner and found Mr. Ashford there, standing near a stone bench, looking out toward the lake. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, and I saw that he was as startled as I was. For a moment, neither of us spoke, Then, with obvious difficulty, he said, "Miss Clark, I did not expect to see you here." I apologized and made to leave. He stopped me with a gesture. "Please," he said, "don't go. He paused, struggling with something. "I find I am very tired of this silence between us." I stood frozen, my heart beating too quickly. I told him that I had thought the distance was best. "Best for whom?" he asked quietly. I could not answer that. Instead, I said what I should have said much earlier. "Mr. Ashford, I think you know that my position here has become difficult for me. Not because of any fault in the household, but because of—" I could not finish. "Because of me," he said. I could not deny it. He came closer, though he maintained proper distance. "Miss Clark, I need to tell you something, and I ask that you allow me to say it once, clearly, so that there will be no misunderstanding between us." He paused, and I could see how much this cost him. "I have developed feelings for you that are entirely inappropriate, given my circumstances. I think you know this. I think you have perhaps felt it yourself. And I want you to know that this causes me great shame, not because of anything lacking in you, quite the opposite, but because I am not free to feel such things. I am bound by vows I took in good faith. My wife is ill, helpless, dependent on my care. Whatever I might feel or wish is irrelevant compared to my duty to her." I found I was trembling. I told him, barely above a whisper, that I understood, that I felt the same shame, the same impossibility. "Then you do," he began, but stopped himself. "Forgive me. I should not ask that." But I answered anyway, because honesty seemed the only thing that might allow us to move forward. "Yes," I said, "I do feel as you do. And it troubles me greatly, because I have no wish to cause harm, and yet I seem incapable of preventing what I feel." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he said, "What are we to do?" I told him the truth, that I did not know, that I had considered leaving, but that I worried Mrs. Ashford had grown accustomed to me and that my departure might distress her, that I could not see any path forward that did not involve pain for someone. We stood there in the garden for a long time, speaking quietly, honestly, about the situation in which we found ourselves. We acknowledged what we felt. We acknowledged that it could never be acted upon. We acknowledged the unfairness of it, the cruelty of finding something precious in circumstances that made it impossible to keep. And we agreed that I would stay, that we would continue as we had been, but with this understanding between us, that we would be honest about what we felt, but that we would not allow those feelings to compromise our duties or our honor. It was the only solution that seemed remotely moral, though it promised nothing but continued pain. That conversation in the garden marked a change. We stopped avoiding each other, but we also stopped pretending. When we spoke honestly. When we were in the same room, we acknowledged each other's presence without fear. The feelings were still there, perhaps stronger than ever, but they existed now within clear boundaries we had both agreed to maintain. It was a strange way to live. We were like two people separated by glass, able to see each other clearly but unable to touch. Every conversation was precious and painful. Every accidental meeting in a corridor carried weight. The smallest kindness, a book left for me to find, a flower from the garden placed on my breakfast tray, felt like both gift and wound. Mrs. Ashford's health remained stable through the summer. She seemed content in her quiet way, aware of very little beyond her immediate surroundings. I cared for her with as much dedication as ever, perhaps more, because I needed to believe that I was at least doing this one thing rightly, that my presence in her house was justified by the genuine service I provided her. Sometimes I wondered if she knew, if some part of her, beneath the fog of her illness, sensed what existed between her husband and her nurse. But she gave no sign of it. She remained as she had always been, distant, fragile, lost in some interior world I could not reach. Autumn came again, marking a full year since my arrival at Thornfield Manor. The leaves turned golden and fell. The air grew cold. And I began to understand that I could not continue indefinitely in this state of suspension. Something would have to change, though I could not imagine what that change might be. It was Mr. Ashford who finally spoke of it. We were in the library one evening in late October. I had been reading there while Mrs. Ashford slept, and he had come in to find a book for himself. We had fallen into conversation, as we sometimes did in these accidental meetings, speaking of small things that felt large because of who was speaking them. Eventually, he said, "Miss Clark, I wonder if you have considered your future, whether you intend to remain here indefinitely, or whether you have other plans." I told him honestly that I had not thought much beyond the present, that I found it difficult to imagine being elsewhere, but that I also knew I could not stay forever. "No," he said quietly. "One cannot stay in such circumstances forever. The human heart is not designed to sustain that kind of tension indefinitely." I asked him if he wished me to leave. He looked at me with an expression of such pain that I immediately regretted the question. "No," he said. "God help me, no. Your presence here has been—" He stopped, struggling. "You have made bearable what was becoming unbearable. But I cannot ask you to sacrifice your life, your future, to remain in a situation that offers you nothing." I told him that was not his decision to make, that I was a grown woman capable of choosing my own path. "But what kind of path is this?" he asked. "What kind of life am I asking you to accept? To care for my wife while we both feel—" Again, he could not finish. I said that it was the life I had chosen, knowing full well what it entailed. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that struck to the heart of everything. "Sometimes I find myself wishing she would—" He stopped abruptly, horror crossing his face. "Forgive me. I should not have begun to say that." But I knew what he had been about to say, because I had thought it myself in my worst moments. The thought that shame had kept me awake more than one night. The thought that made me feel like the worst kind of person. I told him, my voice shaking, that I understood, that I had thought the same, and that it filled me with such guilt I sometimes could barely breathe. "We are terrible people," he said, "but without heat, only exhaustion." I said that perhaps we were simply human, and that being human in impossible circumstances made one think impossible things. We did not speak of it again, but something had shifted once more. We had acknowledged the darkest thought, the most shameful wish, and somehow that acknowledgement made it possible to bear the situation a little better. We were not alone in our guilt. We were not alone in our wanting. And perhaps that shared understanding was enough, or had to be enough, because there was nothing else available to us. Winter came again. The second winter. Mrs. Ashford's condition began to decline more noticeably. She slept nearly all the time now. The doctor came more frequently and spoke to Mr. Ashford in low tones I was not meant to overhear. I understood that we were entering the final phase, that the long suspension was drawing toward its close. I should have felt relief at this. Instead, I felt only sadness. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I had come to understand that her death would not solve anything. Even if she passed, even if the obstacle was removed, too much had happened. We had lived too long in this state of suppressed feeling and conscious guilt. We had trained ourselves too thoroughly to restraint. Whatever might have been possible between us in different circumstances had been damaged by the circumstances we had actually lived through. And beyond that, I could not help but feel that to act on our feelings after her death would be a kind of betrayal, a confirmation that we had been waiting for her to die, even if we had never actively wished it. The timing would taint everything. The freedom would come too late and at too high a cost. Mrs. Ashford died in early February, quietly in her sleep. I was sitting with her when it happened. One moment she was breathing, the next she simply was not. There was no struggle, no pain that I could see. She simply slipped away, as though she had been barely tethered to life and the tether had finally worn through. I called for Mr. Ashford. He came immediately. He stood beside her bed, looking down at her with an expression I could not read. Grief, certainly, but also something else. Relief, perhaps, or release, or simply exhaustion at the ending of a long ordeal. The funeral was small, attended by a few distant relatives and local gentry who had known the family. I did not attend, as it would not have been appropriate for the hired nurse to do so. Instead, I remained at the manor, beginning to pack my belongings, assuming that my employment would end now that the patient had died. Mr. Ashford came to see me the day after the funeral. He looked exhausted, older somehow, as though the ordeal of the past years had finally caught up with him, now that it was over. He asked me not to leave immediately. He said there were arrangements to be made, that the household would need some time to reorganize itself, that he would appreciate it if I could remain at least a few more weeks. I agreed, though I knew this was only postponing what was inevitable. We were excruciatingly careful with each other during those weeks. We barely spoke. When we did encounter each other, we were scrupulously polite, as though we were strangers newly introduced. The understanding we had built over the past year seemed to have evaporated, leaving only awkwardness and uncertainty. I knew he was waiting for the proper mourning period to pass before what? I did not know. I did not know what he intended, what he hoped for, what he imagined might be possible now. And I found, to my surprise, that I did not want to know. I had lived so long with the impossibility of our situation that the possibility of it frightened me more than the impossibility ever had. It was in late March, as the first signs of spring began to appear, that he finally spoke to me directly. I had been in the library, selecting books to return to their proper places, a task I had taken on as a way of making myself useful in a household that no longer needed a nurse. He came in and closed the door behind him. My heart began to race. I knew what was coming, and I did not know how to respond to it. "Miss Clark," he said, "I need to speak with you about the future." I set down the books I was holding and turned to face him, but I could not meet his eyes. "I know," he continued, "that the circumstances of the past years have been difficult for both of us. I know that we have felt things that were inappropriate to feel while my wife lived. I know that we have both struggled with guilt and shame and the impossibility of our situation." He paused. "But she is gone now, and while I grieve for her, while I will always grieve for what she suffered and for what I could not give her, I also find that I must be honest with myself about what I feel for you." I said nothing. I could not. "I am asking you," he said quietly, "if you would consider remaining here, not as an employee, but as—" He stopped, struggling. "I am asking if you would consider becoming my wife when sufficient time has passed and it would be proper to do so." I had known this was coming, and yet hearing the words still struck me like a blow. I looked at him finally, at this man I had come to care for so deeply, and I felt my heart breaking. "I cannot," I said. He looked as though I had struck him. "Why?" he asked. "If you feel as I do, and I believe you do, why can we not now finally allow ourselves what we have denied ourselves for so long?" I tried to explain, though I was not certain I fully understood it myself. I told him that what we had felt in the midst of those impossible circumstances had been real, that I did not doubt the sincerity of it. But I told him also that those circumstances had shaped what we felt, that we had loved each other in the context of impossibility, and that I feared what we felt would not survive possibility, that we had loved each other most deeply when we could not have each other, and that to have each other now would somehow diminish what we had felt. And I told him the hardest truth, that I could not marry him knowing that his wife's death had made it possible, that every happiness we might find together would be shadowed by the memory of her suffering, that I would always wonder if part of me had wished for her death, and whether marrying him would be a confirmation of that wish. "We cannot build a life on such foundations," I said. "It would poison everything we might otherwise have." He was silent for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "What if you are wrong? What if we are denying ourselves genuine happiness out of an excess of scruple?" I told him that was possible, that I might regret this decision for the rest of my life, but that I would regret the alternative more because I would never be able to trust it, never be able to feel it was entirely clean or entirely right. He accepted this, though I could see it cost him greatly. He did not argue further. He simply nodded, looked at me once more with an expression that held everything we had felt and could not act upon, and left the room. I departed Thornfield Manor 3 days later. Mr. Ashford was not there to see me off. He had gone to London on business, or perhaps simply to avoid the pain of goodbye. I left a note thanking him for his kindness and his understanding. I did not say that I loved him. There seemed no point in saying what we both already knew. I returned to London and found work with another family. I cared for their children and taught them their letters, and tried not to think too much about what I had left behind. Over time, the sharpness of it faded, though it never disappeared entirely. There are some things that leave marks too deep to ever fully heal. I heard, some years later, that Mr. Ashford had remarried, a woman from a good family, appropriate to his station. I was glad for him, or told myself I was glad. I hoped he had found some measure of happiness, some peace with his choices. As for myself, I never married. I told myself it was because I preferred independence, because I valued my work, because I had seen enough of marriage to know its costs as well as its benefits. These things were true, but they were not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had loved once, deeply and impossibly, in circumstances that made that love something precious precisely because it could never be fulfilled. And having known that kind of love, that kind of longing, that kind of restraint, I found I had no appetite for anything less. I am an old woman now, living in a small cottage in Kent, supported by savings and a modest pension from a lifetime of work. I have had a good life, I think, a useful life. I have known kindness and purpose and the satisfaction of work well done. But sometimes, in the evenings, when the light fails and the world grows quiet, I think of Thornfield Manor. I think of those long afternoons sitting in Mrs. Ashford's conservatory, watching the seasons change through the glass. I think of brief conversations in corridors, of glances that said what words could not, of a love that existed most perfectly in the space between wanting and having. And I think that perhaps that is all any of us get in this life. Brief moments of connection, glimpses of what might have been, the knowledge that we mattered to someone even if we could not stay with them. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be. I do not regret my choice. I carry the pain of it, yes, but I carry also the knowledge that I acted with honor, that I did not betray the woman who had trusted me with her care, that I did not build my happiness on the foundation of someone else's suffering. That knowledge is cold comfort on long winter nights, but it is comfort nonetheless. We make our choices in this life, and we live with them. Sometimes the right choice and the happy choice are not the same. I learned that at Thornfield Manor, in the company of a man I loved and could not have, caring for a woman who stood between us not through any fault of her own, but simply by existing, by needing, by being as trapped in her circumstances as we were in ours. I learned it, and I survived it, and I am here now to tell you this story of quiet love and quieter renunciation, of wanting and not taking, of choosing honor over happiness, and finding that one can live, quite fully, with such a choice. If you found some truth in this quiet telling, I hope you'll return another evening for more stories of hearts that loved and lost and lived to tell of it.